The evening sky was turning dark when Jake Sullivan drove his black car down Route 47. He was heading home after a long day at the naval base, where he worked as a commander with the Navy SEALs. The road was quiet and empty, with only a few cars passing by every few minutes. Jake kept his speed exactly at the limit, because he knew how important it was to follow the rules even when nobody was watching. His military training had taught him discipline and respect for authority, and he carried those values everywhere he went. Suddenly, bright flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror, and Jake felt his stomach tighten just a little. He had not been speeding, and he knew his car was in perfect condition with all the lights working and the registration up to date. Still, he pulled over to the side of the road and waited with his hands visible on the steering wheel. This was not his first time being pulled over for no clear reason, and he had learned long ago that staying calm and following procedure was the safest approach. "Officer." Derek Hunt stepped out of his patrol car and walked toward the black vehicle, with a hand resting casually on his holster. He had been a cop in Henderson City for 15 years, and he thought he knew trouble when he saw it. Something about this car and its driver made him suspicious, though he could not quite say what it was. Maybe it was the way the car moved so smoothly and precisely, like it was being driven by someone with special training. Maybe it was just his gut feeling telling him to investigate further. Derek reached the window and waited for it to roll down. When it did, he saw a young man in his late 20s with dark skin and calm eyes that seemed to take in everything, without showing much emotion. The man wore civilian clothes, but there was something about his posture and the way he held himself that suggested military background. Derek felt a surge of irritation rise in his chest, though he tried to keep his face neutral. "License and registration," the officer said in a tone that left no room for argument. The driver reached slowly toward his glove compartment, keeping his movements visible and deliberate. He pulled out his wallet and registration papers and handed them over without saying anything at first. Derek took the documents and studied them carefully under his flashlight. The license showed the name Jake Sullivan with an address in the city. But it was the military ID card that caught Derek's attention. Navy Special Operations, it said, with several codes and clearance levels that Derek did not fully understand. There were medals listed and commendations that suggested this man had seen serious combat in dangerous places around the world. Derek felt that irritation grow stronger, because military people always thought they were better than local cops. "Is there a problem, officer?" Jake asked, keeping his voice respectful and calm. Derek looked up from the documents and felt his jaw tighten. The question was perfectly reasonable, but something about the way it was asked made him angry. Maybe it was the calm confidence, or maybe it was the fact that this man clearly knew his rights and was not going to be easily intimidated. "You were doing 45 in a 35 zone, Derek said, even though he knew it was not true. Jake had been going exactly the speed limit, but Derek had learned over the years that most people would not argue with specific numbers. He watched Jake's face carefully, looking for signs of guilt or nervousness, but the man just nodded slightly as if considering the information. "Step out of the vehicle," Derek ordered, his voice getting harder. Jake hesitated for just a moment, and Derek saw him glance at something on his wrist. It looked like a watch, but there was a small button on the side that seemed unusual. Then Jake complied and opened his door slowly before stepping out onto the roadside. He stood there with his hands visible and his posture relaxed but ready. Derek walked around Jake, studying him from different angles. The man was in good physical shape, with the kind of muscle tone that came from serious training rather than just gym workouts. His clothes were neat and clean, and his shoes were practical rather than flashy. Everything about him suggested discipline and control, which only made Derek more suspicious. "I am going to search your vehicle," Derek announced, watching for Jake's reaction. The driver's expression did not change much, but there was a slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was not happy about this. "Do you have probable cause, officer?" Jake asked in that same calm voice. The question was perfectly legal and perfectly reasonable, but it made something inside Derek snap. He stepped closer to Jake and felt years of resentment and anger bubbling up to the surface. He was tired of people questioning his authority, especially people who thought they were special because they wore a military uniform. He was tired of being treated like he was less important than soldiers who got all the respect and glory, while cops like him did the hard work of keeping streets safe every single day. "I do not need your kind." "Questioning my authority," Derek said, and the words came out harsher than he intended. "Your kind always thinks you are special because you played soldier overseas. But out here on my streets, I am the law. He saw Jake's expression change just slightly, and something cold and calculating appeared in those calm eyes. "Officer, I suggest you reconsider your next actions," Jake said quietly. There was no threat in his voice, but there was something else, something that suggested this man had been in dangerous situations before and knew exactly how to handle them. Derek laughed because he thought the suggestion was ridiculous. "Are you threatening a police officer?" he asked. "I am giving you professional courtesy," Jake replied, one service member to another. "So please check my credentials again and call your supervisor, but do not do what you are thinking of doing." Derek felt his anger spike higher because this man was trying to tell him what to do. He grabbed Jake's arm roughly and spun him toward the car. "Hands on the vehicle now," Derek ordered, and Jake complied, but Derek saw him press that button on his watch. There was a small beep and a red light that flashed once before going dark. "What was that?" Derek demanded, yanking Jake away from the car. "Some kind of signal. Are you calling your gang buddies?" he asked. Then Derek made his worst mistake and said something that he knew was wrong even as the words left his mouth. It was a racial slur that he had heard other cops use but had never said out loud before. The moment he said it, he knew he had crossed a line, but his anger was too strong to stop. Jake said nothing, but his body language changed slightly, and Derek realized with a cold feeling that this man was now counting something in his head. Derek pulled out his handcuffs and roughly secured Jake's wrists behind his back. Then he went to his patrol car and grabbed a small plastic bag from his evidence kit. He had done this before when he needed to justify an arrest and nobody had ever caught him. He walked back to Jake's car and opened the glove compartment before placing the bag inside where it would be easy to find. Jake stood by the side of the road, with his hands cuffed behind him and his face completely calm. He was still counting in his head, and Derek did not understand why. The officer was too busy searching through the car and tossing items onto the ground, looking for anything else he could use to justify his actions. He threw Jake's phone into the dirt along with papers and personal belongings. "You think you are special," Derek was saying as he searched. "You think this uniform means anything out here, but I am the law in this county and people like you need to learn respect." Jake did not respond and just kept counting. 14 minutes had passed since he pressed the button on his watch. Only 4 more minutes to go, he thought. Then in the distance there was a sound. It was faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. The sound of engines running fast and vehicles moving with purpose. Derek looked up from his search and saw lights cresting the hill in the distance. Not just one vehicle, but 3 of them moving in formation. "I tried to warn you," Jake said quietly, and there was the smallest hint of a smile on his face. Derek felt his confidence drain away as the 3 black vehicles came closer, and he realized that something very bad was about to happen. 240 miles away at Naval Special Warfare Command headquarters, a console began flashing red. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez was sitting at her station monitoring routine operations when the alert sounded. She jumped to her feet before the second beep even finished because she knew exactly what that signal meant. It was a code black emergency, which meant one of their people was in serious danger. "Emergency distress from Commander Sullivan," Sarah announced to the operations center, and her voice was loud enough to cut through all the other conversations. "Code black," she added, and the entire room went silent for just a moment before exploding into controlled activity. Officers moved to their stations and computers came alive with maps and data streams. Everyone knew the drill, because they had practiced it many times, but this was the first time it was happening for real. Captain Frank Morris was the senior officer on duty that night, and he strode across the operations center with the confidence of someone who had been making life and death decisions for 30 years. "Location," he barked at Sarah, and she was already pulling up the information on her screen. "Route 47 in Henderson City jurisdiction," she replied. Her fingers were flying across the keyboard as she accessed local emergency frequencies and police radio channels. Within seconds, they had access to Officer Derek Hunt's body camera feed. The operations center had technology that could tap into almost any signal if they needed to, and right now they needed to. Captain Morris and a dozen other officers watched the feed in real time. They saw Derek approach Jake's car and demand his documents. They heard every word of the conversation and watched as the situation escalated. "Get me the Henderson Police Chief," Morris ordered, without taking his eyes off the screen. "And scramble the quick reaction force because I want assets on site in under 20 minutes. A young lieutenant nearby looked uncertain and asked if they were actually authorized to do this. Morris turned and looked at the man with an expression that could freeze water. Commander Sullivan has 17 confirmed hostile kills in 3 continents, Morris said in a voice that was cold and hard. He has been wounded twice in the service of this country, and he holds a Navy Cross and 2 Silver Stars. Yes, Lieutenant, we are authorized because we protect our own. The young officer nodded quickly and went back to his station to coordinate the response. At Camp Shepherd, which was only 15 miles from Henderson City, the alert reached SEAL Team 7 within 90 seconds. They had been conducting night training exercises in full combat gear when their communication devices all buzzed at the same time. Commander Lisa Grant looked at her screen and felt her blood run cold. Sullivan was in trouble, and that meant they were moving right now. "Mount up," Lisa ordered, and her voice carried across the training field. "Sullivan is in trouble, and we roll in 3 minutes." Her team did not ask questions or hesitate. They simply moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had trained together for years. 8 of them in total, and each one was among the deadliest operators in the entire United States military. They all knew Jake Sullivan, and most of them had served with him in combat zones around the world. He had pulled 2 of them out of a firefight in Yemen when enemy forces had them pinned down. He had held a position alone for 6 hours in Afghanistan while wounded and waiting for extraction. If Jake Sullivan had hit his emergency beacon, then something was very wrong and they were going to fix it. 3 black vehicles screamed out of Camp Shepherd at exactly 2147 hours. They carried 12 SEALs in full tactical gear along with communication specialists and a legal officer who was already on the phone with military lawyers. The vehicles moved fast with lights flashing and sirens clearing the road ahead of them. Local police heard the sirens and got out of the way because they recognized military emergency vehicles when they saw them. Lisa Grant sat in the lead vehicle, watching the live feed from Jake's emergency beacon on her tablet. The small device in his watch was transmitting everything, and she could see what was happening in real time. She watched Derek Hunt search the car illegally, and she watched him plant evidence in the glove compartment. She watched him use force against a man who was not resisting, and her jaw tightened with anger. "ETA?" she asked her driver without taking her eyes off the screen. 14 minutes, came the reply.
"Make it 12, Lisa said, and the driver pressed the accelerator harder."
The vehicle surged forward and the other 2 followed close behind. They were running hot and fast through the night, and nothing was going to stop them from reaching their teammate. Back at Naval Special Warfare Command, Captain Morris was on a secure line with the Secretary of the Navy. The conversation was brief because both men understood the situation immediately. "We have video evidence of assault and illegal search and racial discrimination and evidence planting," Morris reported. "Commander Sullivan is a decorated combat veteran, and he is being brutalized by a corrupt police officer." The Secretary's response came without hesitation. "Secure our asset and use whatever force is necessary to ensure his safety. I will handle the political fallout on my end." Morris allowed himself a thin smile and thanked the Secretary before ending the call. Then he turned back to the operations center and watched the screens showing multiple feeds from the scene. On Route 47, Jake Sullivan stood with his hands cuffed behind his back and maintained his calm. Derek Hunt was still going through his vehicle and tossing personal items onto the road. Jake's phone and military documents and wallet all lay scattered in the dirt. Derek was looking for anything else he could use to justify his actions, but he was not finding much. "You think you are special," Derek was saying, and his voice was thick with contempt. "You think this uniform means anything out here, but I am the law in this county and nobody questions me." Jake said nothing and just kept counting in his head. 13 minutes had passed since he pressed the button, and that meant his team would be very close now. The sound of engines grew louder, and Derek finally looked up from his search. His face showed confusion at first and then concern as he saw 3 vehicles approaching fast. They were moving in tight formation with their headlights cutting through the darkness like spotlights. The vehicles were clearly military and they were clearly coming here. Jake allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "I tried to warn you," he said quietly, and there was no anger in his voice, just a statement of fact. Derek looked at him and then back at the approaching vehicles and suddenly understood that he had made a terrible mistake. These were not local cops or federal agents. These were military operators, and they were coming for one of their own. The 3 vehicles reached the scene in perfect coordination. They formed a tactical perimeter around the traffic stop in less than 10 seconds. Doors opened and 12 figures in dark combat gear emerged. They moved with precision and purpose, and every movement was coordinated. Night vision goggles gleamed in the headlights and rifles were held in ready positions. Derek Hunt found himself suddenly surrounded by some of the most highly trained warriors in the world. They did not point their weapons at him, but the threat was clear. Each one of these people could probably take him down in seconds, and they all looked ready to do exactly that if necessary. His hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, and 12 rifles came up in perfect unison. A woman stepped forward from the group and pulled out her credentials. Even in full tactical gear, her authority was unmistakable. "Officer Hunt," she said in a voice that carried clearly across the scene. "I am Commander Lisa Grant from United States Naval Special Warfare Command, and you are currently detaining Commander Jake Sullivan, who is a member of SEAL Team 7. We are here to secure our service member." Derek's face went pale, and then red as blood rushed to his cheeks. "You cannot just show up at a traffic stop," he said, and his voice cracked slightly. "I have authority here, and this is local jurisdiction." Lisa looked at him with an expression that suggested she had dealt with people like him before and was not impressed. "Your authority ended the moment you violated Commander Sullivan's civil rights," said another voice. A man in tactical gear stepped forward with a tablet in his hands. "We have complete video documentation of your illegal stop and unlawful search and use of excessive force and evidence planting, not to mention multiple civil rights violations and hate speech clearly recorded on your own body camera." Derek's hand started moving toward his weapon again, and this time the response was immediate. 12 red laser dots appeared on his chest and head. "I would not," Lisa said softly. "Every member of my team is qualified expert marksmen, and several are champion competition shooters. All of them consider Commander Sullivan family." Derek froze and finally understood the situation he was in. "Remove your hand from your weapon," Lisa ordered. "Then place Commander Sullivan's handcuffs key on the ground and step back." Derek complied because he had no choice. One of the SEALs moved forward to uncuff Jake and whispered something that sounded like a greeting between old friends. Jake rubbed his wrists and stood calmly, as if being illegally detained was just a minor inconvenience. More sirens were approaching from multiple directions. The night was filling with flashing lights as local police and county sheriffs and state troopers all converged on the scene. Behind them came 3 black sedans with federal plates. Henderson Police Chief Margaret Collins arrived at the scene to find what looked like a small military invasion on her highway. She had been at home eating dinner when the call came through about a situation involving Navy SEALs and one of her officers. At first she thought someone was playing a joke, but the dispatcher's voice had been deadly serious. Now she stood next to her vehicle looking at 12 armed operators in full tactical gear surrounding one of her patrol cars. Lisa Grant stepped forward to meet the chief, and her credentials were already in hand. "Chief Collins, I am Commander Lisa Grant from Naval Special Warfare Command, and we have a situation here involving one of your officers and one of our decorated service members." The chief looked past Lisa at Derek Hunt, who was standing alone and pale, looking like a man who had just realized his world was ending. "Someone tell me what happened," Collins demanded, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had been running a police department for 20 years. Lisa provided a concise briefing that lasted maybe 3 minutes but covered every important detail. The illegal stop, and the planted evidence, and the racial slurs, and the civil rights violations. Collins listened with her face growing darker and harder with each passing moment. "Show me the footage," Collins said when Lisa finished. The legal officer pulled up the body camera recording on his tablet and handed it to the chief. She watched 3 minutes of Derek Hunt conducting his traffic stop, and her expression went from anger to disgust to something that looked almost like grief. When the video ended, she was silent for a long moment, just staring at the screen. "Officer Hunt," Collins finally said, and her voice was tight with controlled rage. "You are suspended immediately pending investigation, and you will turn in your badge and weapon right now." Derek started to protest, but Collins cut him off with a look that could have melted steel. "Right now," she repeated, and Derek fumbled with his badge and gun before handing them over. The federal agents who had arrived in those black sedans were already conferring with the military legal officer. They were FBI according to their credentials, and they moved with the confidence of people who knew they had a solid case. One of them approached Jake Sullivan with an expression that mixed professional concern with genuine sympathy. "Commander Sullivan, I am Special Agent Rachel Kim, and I am very sorry this happened to you. We will need your full statement, but I want you to know that this case will receive our highest priority. Jake nodded and thanked her politely. He explained that he had full audio and video from his watch, which had recorded everything from a different angle than the body camera. We will need that recording, Agent Kim said, and Jake told her it had already been uploaded to a secure military server. His command would provide access to federal investigators. Kim made notes on her tablet and assured Jake that they would build the strongest case possible. The evidence was overwhelming, and she seemed confident that justice would be served. As federal agents led Derek Hunt toward one of their vehicles, he looked back at Jake one last time. The SEAL commander stood surrounded by his team, looking calm and professional, while Derek's entire world collapsed around him. "You could have told me who you were," Derek said, and it sounded like a desperate attempt to shift blame. Jake met his eyes without anger or satisfaction. "I showed you my military ID and I told you to check my credentials. I gave you every opportunity to do the right thing, but you chose to see my skin color instead of my service. That was your decision, not mine." Derek had no response to that, and the agents put him in their vehicle before driving away toward the federal detention facility. The scene began to clear slowly as various agencies collected evidence and took statements. Chief Collins spoke with Lisa Grant for nearly an hour, discussing the incident and its implications. Collins was clearly shaken because she had known Derek Hunt for years and had never imagined he would cross so many lines. She promised full cooperation with all investigations and committed to reviewing every aspect of her department's operations. By midnight, the highway was finally quiet again. Jake sat in one of the SEAL team vehicles, drinking water and filling out paperwork. His teammate Kyle Patterson sat next to him, offering quiet support. "You think they will actually prosecute?" Kyle asked, and Jake nodded without hesitation. "They have video from 3 angles and audio recordings and planted evidence, and a cop stupid enough to use racial slurs on his own body camera." "Yeah, they will prosecute. You okay?" Kyle asked more seriously, and Jake was quiet for a moment before answering. "I have been shot at by actual terrorists, and I have had people try to kill me in a dozen different countries. But tonight on an American highway, I was more afraid than I have ever been in combat. Because at least in combat, you know who the enemy is, and you know the rules, and you know your team has your back." "We had your back tonight," Kyle reminded him, and Jake smiled slightly. "I know, but what about all the others who do not have a SEAL team to call? What about every other service member and every other person of color who faces this and has no backup coming?" Kyle did not have an answer for that, and they sat in comfortable silence while the last of the emergency vehicles departed. The media arrived within an hour of the incident, and by morning, the story was national news. Reporters had gotten footage of the SEAL team's arrival, which had been carefully edited to protect operational security, but was still dramatic enough to tell the story. Video of 12 armed operators surrounding a single police car went viral within hours. The internet exploded with commentary and debate and hashtags. At Naval Special Warfare Command, Captain Morris fielded calls from Pentagon officials and congressional representatives and media outlets, all wanting information and statements. His message was consistent and clear. "The Navy takes care of its people, and when one of our service members is targeted, we respond. When they are in danger, we protect them, and that is not negotiable." But in private conversations with his senior staff, Morris expressed darker thoughts. "We train these people to be weapons, and we send them into the worst places on Earth. We ask them to make impossible decisions under fire, and then they come home and get treated like criminals by the very people they are sworn to protect. Something has to change, and it has to change now." The story dominated news cycles for days. Military advocacy groups used it as an example of systemic problems. Civil rights organizations pointed to it as evidence of ongoing discrimination. Law enforcement groups argued about proper procedures and oversight. Everyone had an opinion, and the debate grew heated on both sides. Jake Sullivan returned to his duties at SEAL Team 7 the next day, as if nothing had happened. His teammates treated him normally, which was exactly what he needed. But command staff noticed that he volunteered to teach new classes on civil rights and legal protections for service members. He met with junior personnel who had faced similar situations and offered guidance based on his experience. "You are becoming an advocate," Lisa Grant observed during one of their meetings. "Someone has to be," Jake replied. "I was lucky because I had training and backup and the presence of mind to document everything. But there are thousands of service members who would not know what to do in that situation, who would escalate instead of de-escalate, and who would end up in prison or dead because they did not have the resources I had. Lisa told him that the Navy was implementing new protocols. Every service member would carry emergency contact cards, and every base would have a rapid response team. They were working with local law enforcement across the country to establish better communication and understanding. Jake acknowledged that it was a start, but said it should not take a SEAL team. Showing up to ensure a service member's rights are protected the FBI investigation, moved quickly because the evidence was so overwhelming. Within 48 hours, forensic teams had processed every piece of evidence. The planted drugs were traced back to a department evidence locker that Hunt had access to. Cell phone records showed communications with known extremist groups. His personal computer revealed disturbing patterns of racist online activity. Agent Rachel Kim sat in her office surrounded by case files, and her expression grew grimmer with each page she reviewed. 17 complaints in 3 years, she told her partner. Look at the pattern, because 68% of his arrests were people of color, in a county where they make up only 22% of the population. 83% of his use of force incidents involved minorities, and in every single case he walked away clean. How did this not get flagged earlier? Her partner asked. Because he was careful, Kim replied. He documented everything and always had justification, and knew exactly how far he could push before it became actionable. But he made one critical mistake when he went after someone who had the resources and the backup to fight back. Someone who knew the system well enough to document everything and stay calm under pressure. 3 weeks after the incident, Derek Hunt was formally indicted on 14 federal charges. The evidence was overwhelming, with his own body camera capturing everything, and Jake's watch recording providing additional angles. Forensic analysis confirmed the evidence planting, and digital forensics revealed his connections to extremist groups. His attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but federal prosecutors were not interested. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in federal court. Assistant United States Attorney Jennifer Chen led the prosecution, and she had spent 3 months building a case that was virtually impossible to defend against. The defense attorney was a public defender, named Samuel Ross, who knew he was fighting a losing battle, but was determined to give his client the best defense possible under the circumstances. Jury selection took 2 full days because both sides wanted very specific types of people. The prosecution wanted jurors who understood the military and respected service members and believed in equal justice. The defense wanted anyone who might be skeptical of federal power, or who might sympathize with local law enforcement, or who might doubt the military's involvement in civilian matters. They finally seated 12 jurors, with 6 women and 6 men of various ages and backgrounds. The judge was a stern woman named Barbara Wright, who had a reputation for running a tight courtroom and showing no tolerance for games or delays. She instructed the jury carefully on their duties and the charges they would be considering before allowing the attorneys to make their opening statements. Jennifer Chen's opening statement was clinical and devastating. She played the body camera footage in its entirety, without any commentary, and let the jury watch every moment of the illegal stop. Then she played Jake's watch recording from a different angle, showing details the body camera had missed. Then she presented forensic evidence of the planted drugs and analysis of Hunt's online activities and statistical breakdowns of his arrest patterns over 3 years. The evidence will show Chen concluded that Derek Hunt abused his authority and violated Commander Sullivan's civil rights and planted evidence, and committed these crimes because of racial prejudice. This is not a case of a mistake or an error in judgment, but rather a case of a corrupt officer deliberately targeting a decorated service member because of the color of his skin. Samuel Ross did his best in his opening statement to paint Hunt as a dedicated officer who made a bad decision. He suggested that the military response was excessive and that Hunt had been intimidated, and that his words were taken out of context. He argued that good cops make mistakes under pressure, and that his client deserved consideration for his years of service. The jury looked skeptical throughout his entire statement. Jake Sullivan took the witness stand on the 3rd day of the trial. He walked to the witness box in his formal Navy uniform, with his chest covered in ribbons and medals that represented years of distinguished service. He raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth, and then sat down calmly to face the prosecutor's questions. His testimony was clear and detailed, and utterly damning. I was driving exactly the speed limit, he stated. Officer Hunt had no probable cause for the stop. And when I provided my identification, which clearly showed my military status and security clearances, he became more aggressive rather than less. He ordered me from the vehicle without cause and used racial slurs and planted evidence in my vehicle while I was detained. Commander Sullivan Jennifer, Chen asked, "You have faced enemy combatants in multiple theaters of operation. So how did this experience compare to combat?" Jake was quiet for a moment before answering. "In combat, you know the rules of engagement, and you know your mission, and you know your team has your back. You know that if things go wrong, there is a system to protect you. But on that highway, I had none of that. I was alone facing someone with unchecked power, who saw me as a threat because of my skin color, and I have been in firefights that scared me less." "Why did you not resist?" Chen asked. "Because I am a Navy SEAL," Jake replied simply. "I am trained to use overwhelming force when necessary, and I could have disarmed Officer Hunt in about 3 seconds. But I am also trained in discipline and following rules of engagement and trusting the system. I believed that if I documented everything and stayed calm and followed procedure, then justice would be served because I had faith in the system." "And did the system work?" Chen asked. "My teammates came for me," Jake said. "Federal agents investigated thoroughly and the evidence speaks for itself, so yes, the system worked. But it should not take a SEAL team showing up for the system to work, because it should work for everyone every time." The courtroom was completely silent when he finished, and several jurors were nodding slightly. Samuel Ross tried to shake Jake's testimony during cross-examination. He suggested that Jake was exaggerating and playing the race card, and that his military status gave him unfair advantages. Commander Sullivan Ross asked, "Is it not true that you used your military connections to intimidate a local police officer?" Jake looked at him calmly and replied that he pressed his emergency beacon, which was the same beacon that would alert his team if he were captured by enemy forces. "You do not think that was excessive?" Ross pressed. "Officer Hunt planted drugs in my vehicle," Jake replied. "He used racial slurs and violated my civil rights, so what should I have done? Hoped he would not shoot me? Or hoped he would not plant more evidence, or hoped that someone would believe me over a police officer with a badge and a gun? I served this country for 8 years, and I have earned the right to drive down an American highway without being targeted because of my skin color. If using my emergency beacon to ensure my safety is excessive, then the system is broken." The defense had no effective response to that statement. Ross tried a few more questions, but Jake's answers were consistent and unshakable. When the cross-examination ended, Ross looked defeated and Jake stepped down from the witness stand. With the same calm dignity he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal, the prosecution brought forward a series of expert witnesses over the next several days. A forensic analyst confirmed the evidence planting with detailed scientific testimony. A statistician presented data showing Hunt's pattern of racial profiling over 3 years. A psychologist explained the trauma of being targeted by law enforcement. A military expert testified about the training and discipline required of special operations forces. The defense tried to present character witnesses for Hunt, including former colleagues who spoke of his dedication and family members who insisted he was not racist. But each witness wilted under Chen's cross-examination as they were forced to confront the video evidence and statistics and the undeniable pattern of abuse that the data revealed. The trial lasted 2 full weeks with testimony from dozens of witnesses and hundreds of pieces of evidence. The closing arguments were almost anticlimactic because the case was so one-sided. Jennifer Chen simply replayed the body camera footage one more time and then turned to the jury with a simple statement. "You have seen the evidence," she said. "You have heard the testimony from experts and witnesses and the victim himself. Derek Hunt violated his oath and betrayed his badge and targeted an American hero because of racial prejudice. The question is not whether he is guilty because the evidence makes that clear. The question is whether we as a society will hold him accountable for his actions." Samuel Ross made his closing argument appealing to the jury's sense of compassion and asking them to consider that good people can make mistakes. He suggested that the case had become politicized and that his client was being made into a scapegoat for larger social problems. But his words rang hollow against the weight of evidence that had been presented. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned to the courtroom, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The foreman was a retired Army sergeant named William Lopez, and he looked Derek Hunt directly in the eye as he prepared to read the verdict. The courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of people breathing. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts," Lopez said, and his voice was clear and strong. The courtroom erupted in reaction, with some people crying and others cheering, and reporters rushing to file their stories. Judge Wright banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Derek Hunt sat frozen in his chair with his face completely white. Jake Sullivan sat quietly in the front row, surrounded by his SEAL team members, who were all in dress uniform. There was no celebration on his face and no sense of triumph. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the system had worked and justice had been served. Lisa Grant put a hand on his shoulder and squeezed once in silent support. Judge Wright dismissed the jury with thanks for their service and scheduled the sentencing hearing for 3 weeks later. She remanded Derek Hunt to federal custody without bail because the severity of the crimes and the guilty verdict made him a flight risk. Federal marshals led Hunt away in handcuffs while his family sobbed in the back of the courtroom. Outside the courthouse, media swarmed around Jake and his legal team. He gave a brief statement that had been prepared with the help of Navy public affairs officers. "This case was never about revenge or punishment," he said. "It was about accountability and ensuring that those who abuse their power face consequences. It was about protecting the rights of all citizens, regardless of their race or background, and I hope this verdict sends a clear message that no one is above the law." A reporter called out, asking if Jake regretted pressing his emergency beacon. He shook his head firmly. "That beacon has saved lives in combat zones around the world, and it saved my life that night. Not from enemy fire, but from someone who was supposed to protect me." The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks after the guilty verdict. Derek Hunt spent those weeks in federal custody at a detention facility near the courthouse. The weight of his conviction had settled over him like a heavy blanket, and he barely spoke to anyone, including his attorney. His family visited once, but the conversation was strained and awkward because there was nothing left to say. Samuel Ross had filed the required motions for a reduced sentence, citing Hunt's years of service and his lack of prior criminal record and his family obligations. But everyone involved in the case knew these were just formalities. Judge Barbara Wright had wide discretion in federal civil rights cases, and she had made her feelings about this case abundantly clear throughout the trial. The courtroom was packed for the sentencing hearing. Media filled the back rows with cameras and recording equipment. Jake Sullivan sat in his usual place wearing his formal Navy uniform and flanked by members of his SEAL team who were also in dress uniform. Behind them sat representatives from military advocacy groups and civil rights organizations and law enforcement reform movements. This case had become larger than just one incident, and everyone knew it. Before imposing sentence, Judge Wright allowed victim impact statements. Jake took the witness stand once more and looked out at the crowded courtroom before beginning to speak. "Your Honor," he began, "I want to be clear about something, because this is not about revenge. This is not about one bad cop, but rather about a system that allowed Derek Hunt to abuse his authority for years. This is about the 17 other people who filed complaints against him and were ignored. This is about every service member and every person of color and every citizen who has been targeted by someone who was supposed to protect them." Jake paused to gather his thoughts before continuing. "I have served in some of the most dangerous places on earth, and I have made life and death decisions under fire. I have trained for years to handle threats with discipline and precision, but on that highway I felt more helpless than I ever felt in combat. Because in combat there are rules and procedures and accountability, but Derek Hunt believed he was above all of that. I am fortunate," Jake continued, "because I had training and backup and the resources to document everything and fight back. But most people do not have that, and most people who face what I face do not have a SEAL team to call. They do not have federal investigators who take their case seriously, and they do not have the platform to be heard. I am speaking for all of them today. This sentence needs to send a message," Jake said. "Not just to Derek Hunt, but to every law enforcement officer who thinks their badge gives them the right to abuse their power. To every department that looks the other way when complaints pile up, and to every system that protects the abuser instead of the victim. The message needs to be clear that this will not be tolerated now or ever." Jake looked directly at Derek Hunt for the first time. "I do not hate you, Officer Hunt, because I pity you. You had a position of trust and authority, and you could have used that to help people and protect your community and make a difference. Instead, you chose to abuse your power and see enemies instead of citizens, and chose hate over duty. Now you will face the consequences of those choices. When Jake finished his statement, the courtroom was completely silent. Judge Wright nodded slowly while making notes on her legal pad. Then she called for any other statements, and several people came forward to speak. Lisa Grant spoke on behalf of SEAL Team 7 about power and responsibility and the worst kind of betrayal. FBI agent Rachel Kim provided statistics about the other victims and the pattern of abuse that had been allowed to continue. Derek, Hunt's mother, spoke tearfully about her son and insisted he was not the monster being portrayed in the media. She talked about how he had wanted to be a police officer since he was a child and how he had always tried to do his best. Samuel Ross made a plea for leniency, citing Hunt's years of service and his family obligations, and asked the judge to consider rehabilitation rather than purely punitive measures. Judge Wright listened to everything carefully and made notes throughout. When all the statements were complete, she looked at Derek Hunt and told him to stand. Hunt rose from his chair wearing his orange prison jumpsuit, which was a stark reminder of how far he had fallen from his position of authority. His face was pale and his hands trembled slightly as he stood before the judge. "I have presided over many cases in my career," Judge Wright began. "I have seen good people make bad decisions, and I have seen circumstances that led otherwise decent individuals down wrong paths. But this is not one of those cases. The evidence shows a pattern of deliberate abuse spanning years. You targeted individuals based on race and planted evidence and lied on official reports and used your authority to violate the very rights you swore to protect. You did all of this while wearing the badge of a police officer, which is a symbol that should represent justice, not oppression. What makes your crimes particularly egregious," the judge continued, "is that you targeted a man who has served this country with distinction. Commander Sullivan has risked his life to protect the freedoms we all enjoy. He has earned medals for valor and saved lives. Yet you saw him as a threat because of his skin color. And that is not just criminal, but a betrayal of everything this country stands for." Judge Wright paused and looked around the packed courtroom. This case has drawn national attention, and rightfully so, because it represents a problem that goes far beyond one traffic stop. It represents the breakdown of trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. It represents the ongoing struggle for equal justice under law. The sentence I impose today must reflect the seriousness of your crimes and send a message to other officers who might think they can abuse their authority without consequences. On count 1 for deprivation of rights under color of law, I sentence you to 12 years in federal prison. On count 2 for evidence tampering, 6 years to run consecutively. On count 3 for making false statements in a federal investigation, 3 years to run consecutively. On the remaining counts, various terms to run concurrently. In total, you will serve 21 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The courtroom erupted with various reactions. Some people gasped while others clapped. Derek Hunt's face went completely pale and he swayed slightly on his feet. His attorney slumped in his chair, looking defeated. Behind Jake Sullivan, someone whispered a quiet expression of satisfaction. Judge Wright banged her gavel, repeatedly calling for order. Furthermore, Judge Wright continued when the room quieted, "I am recommending that the Department of Justice investigate the Henderson Police Department for systemic civil rights violations. The pattern of complaints and the failure to address them suggests problems that go beyond one officer. This court is adjourned." The gavel came down with finality, and federal marshals moved to take Derek Hunt back into custody. As Hunt was led away, he looked back one final time at Jake Sullivan, who sat quietly with a neutral expression. There was no triumph on Jake's face and no satisfaction in the harsh sentence. Just a quiet acknowledgement that justice, however imperfect, had been served. The system had worked, but at great cost to everyone involved. Outside the courthouse, media swarmed around anyone connected to the case. Jake gave a brief statement to reporters who had gathered on the courthouse steps. "This case was never about revenge or punishment," he said. "It was about accountability and ensuring that those who abuse their power face consequences. It was about protecting the rights of all citizens regardless of their race or background, and I hope that this verdict and sentence send a clear message that no one is above the law. I also want to acknowledge something important," Jake continued. "I had resources that most people do not have, including training and backup and documentation. Most people who face what I face do not have those advantages, and this fight is not over. It is just beginning because we need systemic change and accountability. We need a system where everyone, regardless of who they are, can trust that they will be treated fairly under the law. The sentence sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities across the country. Police unions condemned it as excessive, while civil rights groups praised it as appropriate. Legal scholars debated its implications and what it meant for future cases. Everyone agreed that something fundamental had shifted in how these cases would be handled going forward. In his cell that night, Derek Hunt sat alone contemplating 21 years in federal prison. The reality was finally sinking in, and he understood that his life as he had known it was over. His career was gone and his reputation was destroyed and his family would suffer. He had time now to think about his choices and the power he had abused and the lives he had damaged. Some prisoners found redemption in their sentences, but Derek was still deciding which path he would take. Jake returned to his quarters at the naval base that evening. His teammates had organized a quiet dinner to mark the end of the trial. They did not celebrate because there was nothing to celebrate. Instead, they simply gathered as a team to support one of their own who had been through an ordeal. Kyle Patterson raised his glass and offered a simple toast. To justice, he said, and everyone drank to that. 6 months after the sentencing, Jake Sullivan stood in a large conference room at Naval Special Warfare Command headquarters. Around him sat representatives from military bases across the entire country, along with law enforcement agencies and civil rights organizations and federal officials. The purpose of the meeting was to formalize what had come to be known as the Sullivan Protocol, which was a comprehensive system for protecting service members from discrimination and abuse. The protocol had been developed over months of careful planning and input from dozens of stakeholders. Every service member would now carry an emergency contact card with direct lines to military legal services and base security and federal civil rights divisions. Every military installation would maintain a rapid response team trained specifically in civil rights law and de-escalation techniques. Every local law enforcement agency near a military base would receive mandatory training on working with military personnel and recognizing signs of discrimination. But the protocol went far beyond just emergency response procedures. It established a national database for tracking complaints against law enforcement officers who targeted military personnel. It created oversight committees with real authority to investigate patterns of abuse. It mandated federal review of any case where a service member alleged civil rights violations. The system had teeth, and everyone in the room understood that this represented a fundamental shift in how these issues would be handled. This is not just about protecting military personnel, Jake explained to the assembled officials. This is about creating a system of accountability that protects everyone, because what happened to me could happen to any service member or any veteran or any citizen. The fact that I needed a SEAL team to come to my rescue shows how broken the system was, and we are fixing that. Now, the Department of Justice investigation into Henderson Police Department had concluded 3 months earlier. The findings were extensive and damning. They documented systemic racial profiling and inadequate complaint investigations and a culture that consistently protected officers rather than citizens. The department was placed under federal oversight, with a detailed mandate for comprehensive reform that would take years to complete. Chief Margaret Collins had embraced the changes despite the difficulty and pain involved. She fired 3 officers who had similar complaint patterns to Derek Hunt. She implemented new training programs focused on de-escalation and community relations. She established a civilian oversight board with real authority to investigate complaints and recommend disciplinary action. The department was smaller now and under intense scrutiny, but it was also earning back some measure of respect from the community. We had to tear it down to build it back up, Collins told a reporter during an interview. Derek Hunt was a symptom of a larger disease because we had created a culture where officers felt entitled to abuse their power. That culture is gone now, and we serve the community. We protect rights and enforce laws fairly, and that is what police work should be. The impact of the case spread far beyond Henderson. Across the country, police departments reviewed their complaint procedures and disciplinary systems. Military bases strengthened their liaison programs with local law enforcement. Civil rights organizations gained new tools for documenting and addressing abuse. The legal precedent established by the case was being cited in courtrooms from coast to coast. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural rather than procedural. Service members, particularly those of color, began to speak more openly about their experiences with discrimination. Veterans organizations created support networks and advocacy programs. Military leadership at all levels made clear statements that protecting their people did not end when they left the base or left active service. Commander Lisa Grant spoke at a military justice conference 3 months after the Sullivan Protocol was implemented. For too long, she said, we trained our people to face external threats while ignoring the threats they faced at home. We sent them to the most dangerous places on Earth and expected them to trust that the system would protect them when they returned. Jake Sullivan's case showed us that trust was misplaced, but it also showed us that we have the power to change things. When we stand together and demand accountability and refuse to accept abuse, we can create real change. Jake himself had returned to full duties with SEAL Team 7. He continued his regular training and operations, but he also maintained his advocacy work. He spoke at military academies about civil rights and proper procedures. He conducted training sessions on recognizing and documenting discrimination. He met with young officers and enlisted personnel who had questions or concerns about similar situations they had faced. People ask me if I am angry about what happened. Jake told a group of new recruits during a training session, "The truth is I am not angry anymore. I am determined, because I am determined to ensure that no other service member has to go through what I went through. I am determined to create a system where your uniform protects you instead of making you a target. I am determined to make sure that we as a military stand for the values we claim to defend. But I also want you to understand something important," Jake continued. "What saved me that night was not just my training or my team, but also my faith in the system. I believed that if I stayed calm and documented everything and followed the rules, then justice would prevail. And it did. But that only happened because I had the resources and support to make it happen. Most people do not have that, so our job as service members and citizens and human beings is to create a system where everyone has access to justice." One year after the incident, Jake received an invitation to the White House. The president wanted to recognize his service, both in combat and in advancing civil rights. Jake accepted the invitation but insisted that his entire SEAL team be present with him. They stood together in the East Room wearing their dress uniforms while the president spoke about courage and sacrifice and the ongoing struggle for equality in America. Commander Sullivan could have responded with force that night, the president said. His training gave him the capability and his anger would have justified it. But he chose a different path by choosing to trust the system and document everything and fight the right way. In doing so, he did not just protect himself but created change that will protect countless others for years to come. The president presented Jake with a Presidential Citizens Medal, which was one of the highest civilian honors. But Jake immediately turned and tried to hand it to Lisa Grant. "With respect, Sir," Jake said, "this belongs to all of us. To every SEAL who dropped everything to come to my aid, and to every federal agent who investigated thoroughly, to every advocate who pushed for change, and to everyone who believes that justice should apply equally to all. I was just the person it happened to, and they made sure it mattered." Lisa smiled and handed the medal back. "We were just doing our job, Commander, because protecting our own is what teams do." The room erupted in applause, and Jake accepted the medal with gratitude and humility. Later that evening, the team gathered for dinner at a restaurant near their hotel, and the atmosphere was relaxed and celebratory. Kyle Patterson raised his glass for a toast. To Jake, he said, "For showing us that the hardest battles are not always fought with weapons, for reminding us that courage comes in many forms, and for proving that even when the system fails, good people can make it work." Everyone raised their glasses, but Jake shook his head gently. "To all of us," Jake corrected. "Because none of this happens without teamwork, and without people willing to stand up for what is right, without the belief that we can make things better together." They drank to that and spent the evening sharing stories and memories. These warriors who had fought in deserts and mountains and jungles had now turned their skills toward fighting injustice at home. The changes continued to ripple outward. Through military and civilian communities, new policies were implemented and old ones were reformed. Training programs were updated and oversight mechanisms were strengthened. It was slow work and there were setbacks, but the direction was clear. The system was becoming more accountable and more just. Derek Hunt remained in federal prison serving his 21-year sentence. He had been assigned to a facility far from his hometown, where he worked in the prison library and attended counseling sessions. Some inmates found redemption during their sentences, while others just served their time with bitterness. Derek was somewhere in between, still processing what he had done and what it had cost him. But outside those prison walls, the world kept changing. Service members carried emergency contact cards and knew their rights. Police departments operated under closer scrutiny and clearer guidelines. Communities demanded accountability and got it more often than before. Every time someone stood up against abuse and every time the system worked the way it should, Jake Sullivan's 18-minute wait on that highway mattered a little bit more. That was the real victory, not just one corrupt cop facing justice, but a system learning to work better for everyone. 2 years after the incident, Jake Sullivan sat in a classroom at the Naval Academy addressing a group of young midshipmen who would soon become officers in the United States Navy. The room was packed with students who had heard about his case and wanted to understand what had happened and what lessons could be learned from it. Jake stood at the front of the room in his uniform looking out at these future leaders of the military. "You have all heard about what happened to me on Route 47, Jake began. Some of you have probably seen the videos or read the news stories. But I want to talk to you today not about what happened, but about why it matters and what you need to know as you prepare to lead sailors and Marines into uncertain situations." The students leaned forward, paying close attention, because they understood that this was not just another classroom lecture, but real wisdom from someone who had faced a genuine crisis. "The military teaches you many things," Jake continued. "We teach you tactics and strategy and leadership. We teach you how to use weapons and how to navigate and how to accomplish missions under impossible conditions. But there is something else you need to understand, and that is how to protect your people when they face threats that have nothing to do with combat. How to ensure that the men and women under your command know their rights and know that you will stand up for them." A young midshipman raised her hand and asked a question. "Sir, if you could go back to that night, would you do anything differently?" Jake thought about it for a moment before answering. "I would still press that emergency beacon and I would still trust the system to work. But I wish I could have prevented the situation entirely by somehow helping Officer Hunt make better choices." The problem was not just his actions that night, but all the choices that led him to that point and all the systems that failed to stop him earlier. The changes that came from that case were comprehensive and far-reaching. The Sullivan Protocol was now standard across all military branches. Emergency contact cards were issued to every service member during in-processing. Rapid response teams were stationed at every major installation. Training programs had been updated to include extensive instruction on civil rights and legal protections and documentation procedures. But beyond the official protocols, something more fundamental had shifted. Military culture had always emphasized taking care of your people, but now that extended more clearly to protection from discrimination and abuse by civilian authorities. Leaders at all levels understood that their responsibility did not end at the base gates. When a service member called for help, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Jake's advocacy work had expanded beyond just military audiences. He spoke at police academies about what it felt like to be on the receiving end of discriminatory treatment. He addressed civil rights conferences about the importance of having systems in place to protect vulnerable people. He testified before congressional committees about needed reforms. His voice carried weight, because he spoke from experience and because his case had become a touchstone for discussions about justice and accountability. Lisa Grant had been promoted and now commanded a larger unit with broader responsibilities, but she made time to continue the work she and Jake had started. She personally reviewed every complaint from service members in her area of responsibility. She met with local law enforcement leaders to maintain good relationships while also making clear that abuse would not be tolerated. She was known as someone who protected her people fiercely but fairly. The relationship between military installations and local law enforcement had improved in most places. Police departments understood that military personnel were valuable members of the community who deserved respect and protection. Joint training exercises became common where military police and civilian officers learned from each other. Communication improved and misunderstandings decreased. It was not perfect, but it was better. Henderson Police Department had completed its mandated reforms and was emerging from federal oversight. The department looked very different now with new leadership and new policies, and a renewed commitment to community policing. Chief Collins had retired and been replaced by someone from outside who brought fresh perspectives and no connection to the old ways. The transition had been difficult but necessary. Derek Hunt remained in federal prison with nearly 20 years left on his sentence. He had become something of a cautionary tale in law enforcement circles. His case was studied in police academies as an example of how not to conduct yourself as an officer. Some people felt sympathy for him, while others felt he deserved every day of his sentence. Hunt himself had gone through various stages of denial and anger and slowly was beginning to accept responsibility for his actions. Prison counseling sessions. Hunt talked about his resentments and prejudices and the power he had wielded so carelessly. He read books about civil rights and history and psychology. He wrote letters to his family expressing regret for what he had done to them. Whether he had truly changed or was just going through the motions remained unclear even to Hunt himself. Redemption is a long process, and he had many years ahead to work on it. Jake's SEAL team had deployed twice more since the incident. They conducted operations in dangerous places and came home safely each time. The team remained tight-knit and professional, with a bond forged through shared experiences, both in combat and in supporting one of their own, through a different kind of battle. They knew that what had happened to Jake could happen to any of them, and they were ready to respond if it did. Kyle Patterson had been promoted and now led his own team. He carried the lessons from Jake's case into his leadership style by making sure his people knew their rights and understood the protections available to them. He maintained relationships with local police in every area where his team operated. He was known as someone who built bridges while also being ready to defend his people if those bridges failed. The legal precedent established by the case continued to be cited in courtrooms. Several other cases of police abuse against military personnel had resulted in successful prosecutions using similar legal theories. The message was clear that targeting service members because of their race or perceived threat would result in serious federal consequences. Defense attorneys advised their law enforcement clients to be very careful about how they conducted traffic stops and interactions with military personnel. But Jake was careful to emphasize that this was not about giving military personnel special privileges. It was about ensuring that everyone received equal protection under the law. The systems and protocols developed for service members could and should be extended to all citizens. Emergency contact cards should be available to everyone. Rapid response to civil rights violations should be standard. Documentation and oversight should be universal. Civil rights organizations had indeed adopted many of the techniques developed through the Sullivan Protocol. They created hotlines and rapid response teams and documentation training programs. They worked with community members to ensure people knew their rights and how to protect themselves during police encounters. The model that had been developed to protect military personnel was being adapted to protect everyone. At the Naval Academy, Jake finished his lecture and opened the floor for questions. The midshipmen asked thoughtful questions about leadership and responsibility, and how to balance supporting law enforcement while also protecting their people. Jake answered each question carefully because he understood that these young officers would face similar challenges in their careers. The goal was to prepare them to handle those challenges with wisdom and courage. One student asked the hardest question of all. "Sir, do you think things have really changed, or will we just go back to the way things were once people forget about your case?" Jake looked at the young man and gave an honest answer. "Change is never permanent because it requires constant effort and vigilance. Systems will always try to revert to what is comfortable and easy. That is why we need leaders like you who will continue to demand accountability and protect the vulnerable and refuse to accept injustice." "The case will eventually fade from headlines," Jake continued. "New incidents will capture attention, and my story will become just another example in textbooks. But the changes we made are real, and they are embedded in policy and law and culture. As long as people like you remember the lessons and carry them forward, the change will continue. That is how progress works, through generations of people who refuse to accept that the way things are is the way things must be." When the lecture ended, the students gave Jake a standing ovation. Several approached him afterward with more personal questions or to share their own experiences with discrimination. He listened to each one carefully and offered advice and support. This was part of his mission, now to ensure that the next generation of military leaders understood both their power and their responsibility. That evening, Jake returned to his quarters and reflected on how far things had come. 2 years ago, he had been handcuffed on a highway, wondering if he would survive the encounter. Now he was helping shape policy and culture across the military and beyond. The journey had been difficult but necessary, and the work was far from finished. But for tonight, he allowed himself to feel satisfied with the progress that had been made. 5 years after that night on Route 47, Jake Sullivan stood on a hill overlooking the ocean near the naval base where he still served. The sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of orange and red. He had come here alone to think about everything that had happened and everything that had changed. 5 years was long enough to see real results, but also long enough to understand how much work still remained. The Sullivan Protocol was now standard procedure across all branches of the military and had been adopted by several civilian organizations as well. Thousands of service members carried emergency contact cards and knew they had backup if they needed it. Hundreds of police departments had reformed their procedures and training. Dozens of corrupt officers had been prosecuted and convicted using the legal framework established by his case. But Jake knew that systems alone were not enough. Culture had to change and hearts had to change, and that took generations rather than years. He still heard stories about service members being profiled or harassed. He still saw statistics showing racial disparities in traffic stops and arrests. The progress was real, but the problems were deep and persistent. Lisa Grant had been promoted again and now worked at the Pentagon helping shape policy for the entire Navy. She remained committed to the principles they had fought for and used her position to push for continued reforms. She called Jake regularly to get his input on new initiatives and to share stories about cases where the Sullivan Protocol had made a difference. Their partnership had evolved but remained strong. Kyle Patterson commanded a SEAL team overseas and led them with the same combination of strength and compassion that he had learned from Jake. He made sure his people understood their rights and their responsibilities. He built relationships with local authorities wherever they operated. He was part of a new generation of military leaders who saw protection and accountability as core parts of their mission. Henderson had changed dramatically in 5 years. The police department was unrecognizable from what it had been during Derek Hunt's time. New leadership and new policies and new attitudes had transformed it into something closer to what a police department should be. Crime rates had not increased despite predictions from critics. Community trust was slowly being rebuilt through consistent actions rather than empty promises. Derek Hunt had served 5 years of his 21-year sentence and had 16 more to go. Prison had changed him in ways that were difficult to quantify. He attended every counseling session and educational program available. He read extensively about history and civil rights and his own psychology. He wrote long letters to people he had wronged, though most went unanswered. Whether he had truly transformed or simply learned to perform transformation remained an open question. But some changes in Hunt seemed genuine. He had started a discussion group in prison focused on confronting racism and bias. He worked with younger inmates trying to help them avoid the mistakes he had made. He wrote articles for criminal justice journals about the abuse of police power. His mother visited regularly and saw something different in his eyes now, though she could not quite name what it was. Jake had received letters from Hunt over the years. The first ones were defensive and full of excuses. Later ones showed more genuine remorse and understanding. Jake had not responded to any of them because he felt that Hunt needed to do this work for himself, rather than seeking forgiveness. But he kept the letters in a folder and sometimes read them to gauge whether the change seemed real. The case remained famous in certain circles, though it had faded from general public awareness. Law students studied it in constitutional law classes. Police academy instructors used it as a teaching tool. Military leaders referenced it when discussing civil rights protections. It had become part of the institutional memory of multiple organizations, and that meant its lessons would continue to influence people for years to come. Jake's own life had settled into a new normal. He still served with SEAL Team 7 and participated in operations around the world, but he also spent significant time on advocacy and education work. He had found a way to balance both roles, and both felt important to him. The warrior and the advocate were not separate identities, but two aspects of the same commitment to service. He had been asked many times whether he regretted pressing that emergency beacon or regretted how public the case became. His answer was always the same: I regret that I had to press it because I regret that the situation happened at all. But given that it did happen, I am glad I had the resources to fight back, and I am glad the case became public because that created pressure for change. Personal comfort matters less than systemic justice. The military had honored Jake in various ways over the years. Medals and commendations and speaking invitations and advisory positions. He accepted them gracefully, but always emphasized that he was one person in a much larger movement. The real heroes were the people doing the daily work of reform in police, departments and military units and community, organizations across the country. Standing on that hill watching the sunset, Jake thought about the 18 minutes he had spent waiting for his team that night. At the time, it had felt like an eternity, but in hindsight, it was just a moment that had changed his life and changed many other lives and contributed to changes in systems and cultures. One moment among billions that somehow mattered more than most. He thought about all the people who had been part of the journey, Lisa and Kyle and the other members of his team who had responded without hesitation, Agent Kim and the other federal investigators who had built such a strong case, Judge Wright who had imposed a sentence that sent a clear message, Chief Collins who had embraced difficult reforms, even Derek Hunt whose terrible choices had inadvertently sparked important changes. But most of all, Jake thought about all the people he would never meet who had been helped by the changes that followed his case. Service members who carried emergency contact cards and knew they had backup. Citizens who were treated more fairly by reformed police departments. Young officers who learned better ways to lead. All of them were part of a story that started on a highway but extended far beyond it. The sun touched the horizon and Jake turned to walk back to base. Tomorrow he would continue his work both as a SEAL and as an advocate. There would be training exercises and strategy meetings and speaking engagements. There would be challenges and setbacks and small victories. The work of creating a more just society was never finished because each generation had to choose to continue it. But tonight, Jake allowed himself to feel something close to peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because things were better than they had been. Not because the fight was over, but because the fight was being fought by more people with better tools. Progress was slow and uneven, but it was real, and that was enough. He thought about humanity and its capacity for both terrible cruelty and incredible courage. The same species that produced Derek Hunt also produced the SEALs who came to his rescue, and the investigators who pursued justice, and the reformers who changed systems. The balance between those forces determined the direction of society, and that balance could be influenced by individual choices. Every person who stood up against injustice shifted that balance slightly. Every officer who chose fairness over bias made a difference. Every citizen who demanded accountability contributed to change. The accumulated weight of those individual choices created movements, and movements created change, and change created a better world for future generations. Jake reached the base gates and showed his identification to the guard on duty. The young sailor checked it carefully and waved him through with a respectful nod. Jake nodded back and continued walking toward his quarters. Another day ending and another day beginning. The rhythm of military life continued regardless of individual dramas or victories. In his quarters, Jake sat down at his desk and looked at the stack of letters and requests that had accumulated. Speaking invitations and policy proposals and stories from service members who had used the Sullivan Protocol. Each one represented someone trying to make things better, and each one deserved his attention and support. He picked up the first letter and began to read. It was from a young Marine who had been pulled over while in uniform and had pressed his emergency contact. The response had been immediate and the situation had been resolved without incident. The Marine wanted to thank Jake for creating a system that protected him. Jake smiled slightly and made a note to respond personally. That was what it was all about. Not fame or recognition or revenge, but simply making sure that people could be safe and that systems worked the way they should. One case at a time and one person at a time, the world became a little bit more just. Outside the window, the last light faded from the sky and stars began to appear. Jake worked through his correspondence, answering letters and reviewing proposals and planning for tomorrow. The work continued because the work always continued. That was what service meant, and that was what Jake Sullivan had dedicated his life to in all its forms. 5 years after 18 minutes that changed everything, Jake Sullivan was still serving, still fighting, and still believing that a better world was possible. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary.